I want to begin with something that almost no one says clearly about emotional collapse. It does not announce itself with the dignity we imagine it should have. There is no clean line where the old version of you ends and the rebuilding begins. There's no music, no clear narrative arc, no moment where everyone around you understands what has happened and responds with the perfect mixture of support and space. Most of the time, collapse looks like nothing from the outside. It looks like someone who's still going to work, still answering messages even if a day or two late, still showing up to the things that cannot be avoided, while everything that could be avoided has quietly, completely stopped. Gabor Maté spent 50 years sitting with people in exactly this place. Not the dramatic crisis that gets immediate attention and immediate support, but the quieter, longer, more invisible collapse. The one that happens after the body and the nervous system have simply run out of the resources required to keep performing the life that was being performed. He understood this collapse not as failure, not as weakness, not even primarily as illness in the way our culture tends to frame it. He understood it as information, as the most honest thing the system had said in years. Today I want to walk you through what genuine rebuilding actually requires after this kind of collapse, not the performance of recovery, the rapid return to function that looks impressive to everyone watching and leaves the underlying exhaustion completely unaddressed. The real rebuilding, the quiet one, the one that takes longer than anyone around you will be comfortable with, and that produces on the other side of it something genuinely more solid than what collapsed in the first place. If you're in this right now, if some part of you has quietly stopped functioning the way it used to, even while the visible parts of your life continue forward, drop 777 in the comments. 7777 in the comments. 77. The frequency of the quiet rebuild. When you type 777, you're saying, I am here, in this, and I am ready to understand what this actually requires. Type 777 and let us begin. Gabor Maté made a distinction that I think is essential before anything else can be understood here. He distinguished between breakdown and what he called the necessary dismantling. A breakdown, in the way our culture typically uses the word, suggests something has gone catastrophically and unexpectedly wrong. The necessary dismantling is different. It is what happens when a structure that was never built to be sustainable finally, predictably, reaches the end of what it can sustain. The exhausted person who collapses after years of suppressing their own needs in service of others is not malfunctioning. They're experiencing the entirely predictable consequence of a structure, a self, a life, a way of operating that required exactly this outcome eventually. The collapse is not the problem. The collapse is the system finally telling the truth about a problem that has existed for a very long time. This reframing matters enormously for what comes next, because the person who understands their collapse as a malfunction tends to rebuild in exactly the same shape as before. Patching the cracks, returning to function as quickly as possible, restoring the old structure with slightly more reinforcement. And Gabor Maté observed, across decades of clinical work, that this approach almost always produces another collapse eventually, because the underlying structure, the one that was never sustainable, was never actually addressed. The person who understands their collapse as necessary dismantling approaches the rebuilding completely differently. They ask not, how do I get back to how I was, but what was the old structure actually built from, and was that structure ever genuinely mine? I want to dwell on this question for a moment longer than the script usually allows, because Gabor Maté believed it was the single most important question available to a person standing at the edge of their own collapse. Most people, when they ask what happened to me, are actually asking, how do I stop this from being visible? They want the discomfort to end. They want the appearance of functioning restored. And that desire is completely understandable. The discomfort of collapse is genuinely unbearable. and the social cost of being visibly not okay is real. But Gabor Maté insisted that the question underneath the question, what was this structure built from, and was it ever genuinely mine, requires a different kind of courage. It requires being willing to discover that significant portions of your life, your relationships, even your sense of who you are, were constructed in response to what was required of you rather than what was genuinely true for you. And that discovery, while painful, is the actual beginning of rebuilding something that will not collapse again in exactly the same way. Now, I want to give you the 7 things that genuine, quiet rebuilding actually requires. The first requirement: permission to rebuild slowly. Gabor Maté observed that the people who recover most genuinely from emotional collapse are almost never the ones who recover fastest. The cultural pressure to quote-unquote bounce back, to demonstrate resilience quickly and visibly, frequently pushes people back into functioning before the underlying depletion has actually been addressed. Genuine rebuilding requires permission, often permission you have to give yourself, because it will not consistently come from outside. To move at the pace the actual depletion requires, rather than the pace that makes everyone else comfortable. This is genuinely difficult to practice, because the people around you, even the ones who love you, will often unconsciously communicate that your slow pace is concerning or excessive or evidence that something more is wrong than what you have described. Gabor Maté observed that this pressure rarely comes from malice. It comes from people's own discomfort with witnessing genuine depletion, because it reminds them of capacities in themselves they have not examined. Recognizing this can help you hold your own pace with more steadiness, even when others around you are uneasy with it. The second requirement: an honest inventory of what actually collapsed. Before rebuilding, Gabor Maté insisted on genuine clarity about what specifically gave way. Was it the capacity to keep meeting everyone else's needs while ignoring your own? Was it a relationship structure that required constant self-erasure? Was it a work identity that demanded more than was sustainable? Was it the belief that you needed to be useful in order to be worthy of care? The rebuilding that follows depends entirely on an honest answer to this question, because rebuilding the same unsustainable structure with slightly more willpower is not recovery, it is delay. This inventory is not a single conversation or a single journal entry. Gabor Maté described it as an ongoing practice, returning again and again over weeks and months to the question of what specifically gave way, because the answer tends to reveal itself in layers. The first answer is often the most socially acceptable one. The deeper answers, the ones that actually inform genuine rebuilding, frequently take longer to surface and require a level of honesty with yourself that the early days of collapse rarely permit. The third requirement: reconnection with the body before reconnection with productivity. Gabor Maté consistently observed that the nervous system needs to come back online, needs to feel safe, regulated, genuinely at rest before the mind's plans and ambitions can be meaningfully pursued again. Most people attempt this in reverse order, trying to think their way back to motivation, while the body remains in a state of depletion that no amount of mental effort can override. The body's genuine signals, what restores energy, what depletes it further, become the most reliable guide available during this phase. This often means tolerating long periods that look from the outside like very little is happening. Gabor Maté described this as one of the hardest parts of genuine rebuilding, precisely because it offends our cultural instinct that visible effort equals genuine progress. The nervous system does not heal on a schedule that satisfies a calendar or a to-do list. It heals according to its own actual capacity, and that capacity expands gradually, in ways that are often invisible, until quite suddenly, something that felt impossible a few weeks earlier becomes available again. The fourth requirement: grieving what the collapse revealed. Often what becomes visible during collapse is not only exhaustion but loss. The loss of relationships that depended on the old unsustainable structure, the loss of an identity that no longer fits, sometimes the loss of years spent operating in a way that, looking back honestly, was never sustainable to begin with. Gabor Maté insisted that this grief needs to be genuinely felt rather than bypassed in the rush toward recovery. Skipped grief tends to surface later, often at the worst possible moment. This particular grief is complicated because it often involves mourning things that from the outside might not look like losses at all. Mourning the version of yourself that always said yes. Mourning the specific kind of approval that came from being endlessly available. Mourning the comfortable certainty of a life that, while exhausting, was at least predictable. Gabor Maté observed that people frequently feel ashamed of this grief, as though they should simply be relieved to be free of an unsustainable pattern. But genuine rebuilding requires the full and honest acknowledgement that even unsustainable structures held real meaning, real relationships, real moments of genuine connection. And letting them go is a real loss, regardless of how necessary that letting go actually is. The fifth requirement: rebuilding boundaries before rebuilding output. Gabor Maté observed that collapse frequently follows years of boundaries that were never genuinely established, saying yes when the honest answer was no, absorbing responsibilities that were never genuinely yours to carry. The rebuilding that lasts begins with the much harder work of establishing genuine limits, even when those limits disappoint people who had grown accustomed to the old, boundaryless version of you. This requirement deserves particular attention because it is so frequently misunderstood. Establishing a boundary is not, primarily, an act directed at another person. It is, first and most importantly, an act of genuine self-recognition. The acknowledgement that your own capacity, your own needs, your own limits are real and worth honoring, independent of whether anyone else approves of them. Gabor Maté observed that people who collapse from chronic overextension frequently have a deep, largely unconscious belief that their own needs are simply less legitimate than everyone else's. Rebuilding boundaries in this light is less about the specific word no, and more about the much deeper work of believing that your own experience genuinely counts. The sixth requirement: tolerating the discomfort of being seen differently. As genuine rebuilding occurs, the people around you notice the change, and not everyone welcomes it. Gabor Maté observed that this is one of the most underestimated difficulties of authentic recovery. Some relationships were specifically sustained by the unsustainable version of you. And as you rebuild differently, those relationships genuinely shift, sometimes ending. This is a real cost, and pretending it will not happen does not prepare anyone for it. He was honest that this particular requirement is often the one that causes people to abandon genuine rebuilding partway through, returning instead to the old, familiar pattern simply because the relational cost of continuing felt too high. There's no way around this honestly, except to say that it is genuinely difficult, and that the discomfort of being seen differently by people who preferred your old shape is one of the most reliable signs that the rebuilding is actually working. The seventh requirement, and the one Gabor Maté considered most essential of all: rebuilding around what is genuinely yours rather than what is merely familiar. The final and most important distinction in genuine rebuilding is between what feels familiar, the old patterns, the old identity, the old way of relating, and what is genuinely, authentically yours. Familiar feels safe because it is known. But familiar is frequently exactly what produced the collapse in the first place. The quiet comeback that actually lasts is built not from familiarity, but from honest, patient, often uncomfortable contact with what is genuinely true for you now, even when that truth requires building something that has never quite existed before. Gabor Maté observed that this distinction takes time to learn to recognize in yourself, because familiarity and authenticity can feel remarkably similar in the moment, especially early in the rebuilding process. The practice he recommended was simple but demanding. In any given choice, ask not, does this feel comfortable, but does this feel genuinely mine, even if it is uncomfortable? Over time, this question becomes a more reliable compass than comfort ever was. This is slow work. It does not photograph well. There is no single moment that captures it, no dramatic before and after that satisfies the narrative our culture wants from a comeback story. But Gabor Maté observed, across 50 years of witnessing exactly this kind of quiet, unglamorous rebuilding, that it is the only kind that genuinely holds. I want to close with something Gabor Maté said to a patient who was deep in this exact process, frustrated by how slow and invisible the rebuilding felt compared to how dramatic the collapse had been. He told her that collapse is loud because it happens to a structure all at once. Rebuilding is quiet because it happens to a self, one honest choice at a time. The quietness is not a sign that nothing is happening. It is a sign that what is happening is finally, genuinely real. And the privilege of a lifetime, the one Gabor Maté pointed toward across decades of sitting with people in the aftermath of their own collapse. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not the rebuilt version of who you were, something more honest than that.